I think Sunday school has pretty much ruined this story. No, I really do, because I vaguely remember a song that ran, maybe some of you do as well. Zacchaeus was a very little man, and a very little man was he. He climbed up into a sycamore tree for the Savior he wanted to see. And the verse ended, "Now Zacchaeus, you come down, for I'm coming to your house for tea." I'm coming to your house for tea. The song suggests a cute little man shinning up a tree to make sure he doesn't miss the parade, and ends with an apparent invitation to tea and cake. Nothing really could be further from the truth. For first point, Zacchaeus was not cute, he was loathsome. He was loathsome. He was probably the most hated man in Jericho. Why? Because Zacchaeus was a tax collector. And not just any old tax collector, he was the chief tax collector for Jericho. That meant Zacchaeus, or those working for him, have taken money out of the pocket of every single person in the city. That's why everyone looks at Zacchaeus with loathing. He is like a mobster. You might think, well, why? Why is gathering taxes so wrong? And I do apologize if there are any representatives of HMRC here this morning. Simply because Zacchaeus wasn't gathering taxes to support an elected government. He wasn't gathering taxes to pay for essential public services. He was gathering taxes for the enemy, for Rome. For Rome that was occupying Israel and persecuting God's people. And remember, Rome was basically using their taxes to make the Jews pay for the cost of their own oppression. Zacchaeus was working, in other words, for the enemy. Now, God's people still had to give their tithes and sacrifices to support the temple, the priests, the Levites. All the taxes to Rome came on top of those. So tax collectors were seen as a primary agents of Roman oppression. They were the main way the occupation impacted people's daily lives. And that meant they were uniformly despised. But chief tax collectors were in a worse category of their own. For one thing, yes, they employed the ordinary tax collectors who funneled all of the money collected to them. But much worse than that was the practice of tax farming. Tax farming. That meant that people like Zacchaeus presented a bid to the Roman authorities for the contract to raise taxes in an area like Jericho. So in their bids, they promised to raise a certain sum. If their bid was the highest, they got the contract. Say that Zacchaeus had bid to raise 1 million denarii for the contract. The Romans weren't then bothered if he raised 1.1 million, but only gave them 1 million. As long as they got what had promised, the Romans didn't care how the money was raised or whether money was collected, more money was collected than was due. They were just delighted that someone else was doing it for them. Now, the incentive for someone like Zacchaeus is obvious, isn't it? Bid high enough to get the contract, and then screw out of the population as much as you possibly could in whatever way you could. Now, Zacchaeus clearly knew his business. He's not only got the contract, he is now filthy rich. Not through hard labor in the fields, not through producing goods for sale, but rich simply by creaming up as much off the top as he could from everyone else's hard work. Can you not start to see how such a man would be despised? Doing the enemy's work for them and getting rich by collaborating with the enemy. Everything Zacchaeus owns, pretty much, has been taken from others, taken from the people he lives amongst. That's why I'm guessing he rarely, if ever, went around without henchmen, without security, especially not when he was handling money. He never went around without hired muscle to keep him safe. Think of him as a mobster. That's who he was. Probably aren't many in Jericho who haven't cursed him or maybe even dreamed of getting even with him in a dark valley sometime. Zacchaeus is despised and he is feared. Far from a cute, jolly little man scrambling up a tea with a promise of cake, Zacchaeus is the most hated man in Jericho. Second point, Zacchaeus wants to see without being seen. He wants to see without being seen. The streets of Jericho are lined by people excited to see Jesus on the way to Jerusalem. They're probably a bit miffed, honestly, that Jesus is just passing through, verse 1. Yes, they're delighted to see him, but they'd have loved him to stay and minister among them at least for one evening, one night. One of them is Zacchaeus. News that Jesus is going to pass through Jericho has reached him. He's interested, he's intrigued enough to want to see Jesus. Probably verse 3 means, I think, something like to see what kind of man Jesus was. So there's at least the beginnings of stirring in him. There might be a hope for hope, maybe, and yet not one he wants to advertise. He wants to see without being seen. He wants to try before he buys. But Zacchaeus has two problems. First, he knows he's hated. And second, he is really short. Literally, it says of little stature. So he simply cannot stand over the back and see over the heads of the people lining the streets. And he dare not try to push his way to the front because he fears the locals will either close ranks against him, shunning and humiliating him, or maybe they'll even assault him. He fears being beaten up. So desperate to see Jesus without being seen, Zacchaeus does two things that Middle Eastern adults never do. He runs. They never do. If you want to be taken seriously in Middle Eastern society, you move as slowly as possible. But he runs ahead along the route to Jerusalem, and there he climbs a tree, which he has probably not done for decades. Now, I'm told, I have seen sycamore fig trees in Jericho, I'm told that they do offer good cover, but he is still spotted. I'm guessing an adult shinning up a tree, even at a distance, is going to cause you to take a second look. And I'm guessing an adult in a tree for the first time, maybe in decades, is not going to be lying in wait as stealthily as Bear Grylls. He's probably clinging on for dear life. Notice, we're not told that Jesus is the first to spot Zacchaeus. We're simply told that when Jesus reached the spot, then he looked up and spoke to Zacchaeus. I don't think that tells us others haven't already been talking to him, or abusing him, or shouting at him. I think that's what's happened. He's been spotted by the population that hates him. That's what happens, is that others got there first. So when Jesus reaches the spot in verse 5, a crowd has already gathered around the tree. They're enjoying abusing their humiliated chief tax collector who's been found bizarrely halfway up a tree. I think their shouts of abuse are probably what reveals Zacchaeus' name to Jesus. So imagine the ugly scene. Zacchaeus is stuck, getting verbally abused, I reckon, by those gathering at the bottom of the tree, fearful that he will be physically abused if he dares to come down. He had wanted to see without being seen. He's now just desperate to escape and hide. Third point, Jesus protects Zacchaeus. Jesus protects Zacchaeus. The most hated person in Jericho stuck up a tree. He's humiliated, he's vulnerable to assault. Many of his neighbors who've been fleeced by him are enjoying abusing and shouting at him at the bottom of the tree. And many of those standing at the bottom are itching to have a go at him if he dares to come down. It's not too much to imagine that a few stones or missiles have already been thrown, or at least have been picked up ready to throw. He is so hated, a lynching isn't entirely out of the question. But then Jesus intervenes. When he takes in the scene, Jesus places Zacchaeus under his protection. Verse 5, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. He's basically saying to the crowd, all of you who came out to cheer me today, understand this man is now under my protection. I am going to stay at his home. Now, everyone knew that Jesus had already walked through Jericho on his way to Jerusalem at the cross. Everyone knew he was simply passing through. But now he proposes to go back into Jericho, to go back and stay at the house of the most hated man in the city. Why? To give Zacchaeus an opportunity to be saved. Everyone is astonished, Zacchaeus included. Not least because in Middle Eastern culture, you never invite yourself anywhere. What Jesus has just done is actually quite rude. He's invited himself to Zacchaeus' home. But inviting yourself to that man's house is unimaginable. To many listening, it's disgraceful even to contemplate. It's outrageous, almost obscene that the Messiah, the Son of Man, would go to that man's house. This is a massively unpopular decision to take. It's courageous and it's risky. Nothing that Zacchaeus has done until now merits such a courageous act from Jesus. I think Zacchaeus scrambles hurriedly down in the pause while the crowd's digesting what Jesus has just said. So yes, of course, in verse 6, he welcomes Jesus gladly. He welcomes him as both guest and protector, for he knows what a risk Jesus has just taken for him. And let's face it, he's also glad to just be on the ground. You bet he's rejoicing. He's just got down in one piece and no one has yet taken a swing at him. But it is not going down well with the crowd. Verse 7, all the people saw this and began to mutter, which is always a word for spiritual anger. Mutter, grumble. He has gone to be the guest of a sinner. In placing Zacchaeus under his protection, Jesus makes himself the subject of angry muttering. And something like this is being said. How can you, the Messiah, refuse our hospitality? Remember, verse 1 tells us that he was merely passing through. You refuse our hospitality, and then you go and be his guest? To break bread with such a hated, notorious sinner? How can you, Jesus? How can you associate yourself with such a man and such a household, all paid for by sharp practice and theft? How can you, the Messiah, do such a thing? Zacchaeus had wanted to see without being seen, yet Jesus has seen him, recognized his situation and acted to protect him. And he's now having to watch the crowd beginning to turn on Jesus and knowing that he's the reason their rejoicing is turning to mutinous anger. Maybe he'd fall into the ground after scrambling down from the tree. But now, in verse 8, Zacchaeus bravely stands up. Bravely stands up to defend Jesus in a way. Stands up and starts to make amends. Starts to ensure that his disgrace doesn't get associated with Jesus. Look, Lord, he says in verse 8. Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. And that recalls Exodus 22:1, where the penalty for theft, the requirement required for theft, is 4 or 5 times. With that startling promise ringing in the ears of all who wanted to beat him up, Jesus pronounces in verse 9 that Zacchaeus, however reluctant they are to accept it, however unwilling they are to receive him, Zacchaeus is once again their brother. Today's salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. He's your neighbor. He's your brother. You all thought he was lost beyond redemption, thought you'd be doing God a favor by beating him up and abusing him. He was a traitor worthy only of contempt. You all thought him beyond the reach of God's loving kindness, and yet I came as the Son of Man to seek after people like Zacchaeus, seek after them and give them a chance to come home. Be amazed at how willingly he has come home, and rejoice at how completely he wants to make amends. So what does this mean for us today? It challenges us first Are there situations where I need to make amends? It's not that making amends is what leads to forgiveness. That comes through grace as we put our faith in what Jesus has done on the cross. It's rather that the desire to make amends shows the reality of Zacchaeus' penitence, the reality of his desire to be forgiven and to turn and live a holy life. That's what Jesus sees as the coming of salvation. What Jesus sees as him becoming again a son of Abraham. Sometimes we ask for forgiveness without any real intentional desire to change. Sometimes we treat grace as though it's cheap, not costly, disposable, not precious. Sometimes we treat forgiveness as a casual thing, rather than one wept and sweated and bled for on the cross. So where might we need, as Zacchaeus does here, to seek the forgiveness of someone whom you've wronged? He'd wronged a whole city. And to seek that not just in words, but in deeds. Where might we need to make amends? It invites us second. If we're in a position like Zacchaeus was, where we want to see without being seen, to try before we buy, to know that you are seen. You are seen by the Lord Jesus. Maybe you want to spectate like Zacchaeus did, to see what kind of a man Jesus was. But there comes a point when you have to know that you have seen by Jesus and you have to come down and meet with him. If you're in that place where you want to see without being seen, know that Jesus sees you this morning and he wants to meet with you. It challenges us, third, to show courage, to be willing to show courage. Certainly, at least twice in the Gospels, here and in John 8, with the woman taken in adultery, Jesus directly faces down violence. In both incidents, there's a moment where I think everything hangs by a thread. Jesus not only sees the right thing, he has the courage to do the right thing, to interpose himself between others and violence. He saves both Zacchaeus and the woman taken in adultery from serious assault, even from being killed. Where might we be called to show courage in the defense of others? Perhaps at work, where ill treatment and bullying is happening to others. Perhaps on our city streets as a street pastor or a volunteer for Amber, or as a foster carer, or someone working with an organization like Safe Families for Children, standing between the vulnerable and violence or abuse. Perhaps through praying, giving or volunteering with IJM, seeking to stand between the vulnerable and those who would abuse them for gain. Perhaps to do the right thing even when it's costly and we don't know and can't calculate the consequences. Perhaps to speak words of truth, spoken lovingly and graciously, but nevertheless still spoken. Perhaps to share the gospel with a friend, even if you think you're risking the relationship, so that Jesus can come between them and their sin. At this moment and in this season, being people of faith requires us also to be people of courage. Where is Jesus calling you to show the same kind of courage he shows here? For whom and in what context? And how will you respond? And it reminds us finally that grace is outrageous. Grace is outrageous. We risk sanitizing this story about singing about a cute little man who's coming to tea. But this story has got nothing to do with cake. It is the redemption of a loathsome git, a monster who has enriched himself by fleecing the whole city. It's about Jesus stepping in to offer that rightly despised person entirely unmerited favor, and doing so to save him in that moment from violence. Grace is outrageous. It really is. It cuts across what should happen. It breaks the cycle of crime and punishment. Jesus is willing to suffer and die even for people like Zacchaeus, and not just for mostly nice people like you and me. He does it for you and me, and he does it for loathsome gits like Zacchaeus also. The contempt shown to Zacchaeus was deserved. He'd betrayed his own people, he'd stolen from his neighbors, he'd enriched himself on behalf of the occupiers. There's no way at all that he deserves what Jesus does for him. Truthfully, there are few less likely or less deserving converts than Zacchaeus, and yet Jesus offered him a way home, and he came home rejoicing. Grace is not just amazing. To those in Jericho at the foot of that tree, grace was outrageous. It means getting what we simply do not deserve and never will. How outrageous is the grace we believe in? How outrageous is the grace we're willing to live? How open are our hearts and arms to offer not just an amazing grace, but an outrageous grace to those around us? At the foot of the tree in Jericho, at the foot of the cross in Calvary, grace has been and always will be outrageous. Let's receive it. Let's offer it. Let's celebrate it. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. Amen.